So last week we talked about kind of the early days of the area and the settlers that came in and everything that they had to go through. And then today we're going to pick up with kind of the next phase of things. Oh, we got a couple people coming, so. So we talked about Enoch Purley, and then we talked about the interesting person that he brought along with his family, and that being Chloe Purley. So today we'll talk more about what it was like in this area to be a minority in the midst of all of those Puritans. So a little background on why we have something called the Abolition Movement and the Underground Railroad. Somebody came up with this really bright idea that it would be really great if we could get some free labor, and if we could bring them from someplace else, then we wouldn't have to worry about how, maybe that wasn't the best thing to do. I don't know. So there was a whole setup where the slaves would be brought from Africa, and sometimes they would be sold by their own people. They would be sold by a neighboring tribe, or they would be just kidnapped, basically. So then put them on ships, bring them to either to the West Indies or to the United States, to the colonies at that point. And then there was a constant shifting of goods back to England, because England really wanted everything that the colonies had. So the colonies were shipping back tobacco and codfish and cotton, all sorts of things, whatever we could produce in the colonies. England was a hungry market for that. So in order to create those goods, we brought in the labor to help make the goods, to harvest the stuff, whatever it was, and then ship that to England. So there was this triangle going on between Europe and Africa and the colonies, and also between with the West Indies. So there was a huge amount of economic ties to the slavery trade, which set up the United States for some really tough stuff. So we had this idea in this country that all men are created equal, right? All men except for some. Come on in. We might have to split you up a little bit. But, looks like that might be a good idea anyway. So, the Founding Fathers decided that we would have a country that's based on liberty, right? But it was only liberty for certain people, and there was this built-in, at the very beginning, difference of opinion. Some people said, well, all men are created equal should be all men. And some people said, well, no, just some of us, kind of the ruling class, we're the ones that are created equal. And then, of course, there were those unfortunate half of the population called women. Does that include women? Are women created equal along with men? So it was there at the beginning. And we're still dealing with it today. So then we have, I don't know about when all of you were in school, some of the older people here, but we were taught pretty much that the North was the good guy and the South was the bad guy, because the North thought that slavery was bad and the South thought that slavery was good. So that makes it kind of easy, right, if you've got good guys and bad guys. Unfortunately, that's not really what the truth was. It was a lot more complicated than that. So you had people who were Northerners who thought that slavery was good, and they thought that we shouldn't be interfering in other people's business anyway. And then you had people in the South, some of the best, most vocal abolitionists came from the South. They said, no, we don't think this is a good idea at all. And then there were a lot of people who were in the middle who were saying, we need to compromise. And that compromising set the country up for a lot more difficulties, unfortunately, in the long run. So the abolition movement came about from those people who said that slavery is not a good idea. It's just not a good idea. It's wrong to take other people from their homeland by force. It's wrong to keep people living without personal freedom. They could not marry by their own choice. They could not own property. They couldn't vote. They had no rights. So they were not citizens even though they were here in this country. So the abolitionists said, we need to do something about this. This is wrong. We don't think this is a good thing for the country. We don't think it's obviously a good thing for the people who are enslaved. Got like 3 chairs over here and another one over here if anybody wants to slide on in. Look at all the kids. I love this. Now, one of the things that was happening in New England was that there was a very big split. We had some churches who were very adamant that abolition was the way to go, slavery was an evil, we had to get rid of it. And then you had other people in churches saying, hey now, we shouldn't be talking about this in church. This isn't a place to talk about this. We shouldn't be doing this. And then you had that other section of people who were saying, what's wrong with you? Of course we should be talking about this in church. This is what church is all about. I mean, if you are a Christian church and you don't support the abolitionists, then what's wrong with you? So there was a lot of difficulty and a lot of discussions and a lot of arguments. You think we're divided today in this country? Boy, I'll tell you, back then it was even worse. So the book that I'm basing this talk on today, which is actually the book that my research was the cause of. So it's called Beneath Freedom's Wing. And it's called Beneath Freedom's Wing because there was a New England poet named John Greenleaf Whittier. And he was very anti-slavery. And he has a poem that he wrote, or a poem, depending on what part of the country you're from, where he says, basically, how can we have a country that's founded on freedom, and yet we have all of these people who are enslaved? So under freedom's wing, how can this be going on? So that's why it's called Beneath Freedom's Wing. But there were a lot of very vocal abolitionists in New England. It was part of the whole Puritan ethic that you did not enslave people. And back in those days, there were no cell phones. Those were the days, my friends. So there was very much a presence of slavery in the New England states. They did get rid of it after a while. Vermont was actually the first state to abolish slavery because Vermont is a forward-thinking kind of state, a very interesting state. So they abolished slavery in 1777. And then Massachusetts followed up in 1788, which means that Maine abolished slavery in 1788 as well because Maine was part of Massachusetts. Now I mentioned there were some compromises that happened along the way. So what was going on was people were trying very much to keep the country from descending into a war and to kind of ease the tensions. So they said, well, we've got these states that they don't want to be slave states, and we've got these states that are slave states. And the country was growing like crazy at that point. There were people moving from New England out towards the western areas, and they were really spreading out from the east towards the west. So there were a lot of new states that were trying to come into the Union. So they said, well, okay, here's what we'll do. When this state comes in as a slave state, then this state can come in as a free state. Great, no problem. So they had a compromise in 1820 called the Missouri Compromise, which was when Maine became a state. So they said, well, Missouri can come as a slave state, and Maine comes in as a free state. fantastic. Except that there were still all those slaves. So the compromise didn't really settle that issue. It might have kind of eased things for some people, but it still didn't settle that issue. Not sure if he had a question or if he was just, giving me an amen. Did you have a question?
Oh, no, it's just been attention.
Oh, okay. I want to talk about a man named Daniel Webster. He's a pretty famous guy, New Hampshire man, and was related to everybody, as we talked last week, everybody's cousins. So he was a very popular guy. He was, I think, the first headmaster kind of guy at Freiburg Academy. And he was very much welcome in all of the homes in the neighborhood until the Compromise of 1850. Well, Daniel Webster was seen in the New England area as a native son. He was one of us. Not that I'm from New England, but he was one of us. And he came out in favor of the Missouri Compromise. And so everybody in New England said, what? Let me tell you what they said. This is a letter that was written by a woman we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And she says, and how ought I to feel toward the Northern senator, that traitor, Daniel Webster, without whose influence this odious bill would never have become a law? This man whom heretofore we have all delighted to honor, who was born and educated in the land of the Puritans, who has long sat under the banner of New England's praises and received the emblems of the Savior's sacrifice at New England altars. I cannot but feel this, that the statesmanship and moral bearings of this measure indicate strongly that what is said of him is true, that his intellect has become influenced and bewildered by strong drink. She goes on to say that she cannot regard him with anything but detestation. So Daniel Webster at this point in time was kind of on schedule to become president. That was the next thing for him. He was a senator. He was very well respected in New England. New England was still very powerful politically. And so that was his next thing, was to be president. But when he came out in favor of the Missouri Compromise, it shot it right out of the sky for him. That was it. He was all done. Because he lost the support of the home folks. And the home folks were having none of it. So Daniel Webster, even though we remember him now, sort of, oh yes, he's that good man from the orator from New Hampshire. He had his day in the sun, and then, he crashed. And the other thing that was going on is, and it became part of these compromises, is there was something called the Fugitive Slave Act. There was one originally in 1793, and it said this: if a slave escapes from his master, then the master can go get the slave. And it doesn't matter whether it's been 50 years, that person can still be taken back if the slave owner can capture them. And there were slave hunters who went out canvassing the neighborhood looking for slaves. Now, the other thing that happened with that was that you didn't necessarily have to be a slave in order to get captured and taken back to the South. So there was a movie that came out just a couple of years ago called 12 Years a Slave. And that's exactly what happened to that man. He was born free, but slave catchers came along, grabbed him, and took him back and said, oh yeah, that's the slave that I used to own. Right, yeah, thanks for bringing him back. So for 12 years, he lived as a slave, even though he had been born a free man. So there's a lot of stuff like that going on, right? Because why? There was money involved. So if I capture a slave and I take him back to his master, that master is going to give me money for doing that. So if you're a person who is mostly interested in making money, that's a way to do it. Yes, sir.
What was the movie called again?
12 Years a Slave. You're welcome. So part of the Missouri Compromise in 1850 was a renewal of this Fugitive Slave Act. And that's why Mrs. Fessenden, whose letter I was just reading from, that's why she was so angry. Because here's Daniel Webster, who has been brought up in the abolitionist tradition, because it's been around so long, at that point it's a tradition. She's so angry with him because he has betrayed that sensibility. So the new Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 said we're going to make this stronger than the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. We're going to make it tougher. So if you aid a slave on his way to freedom and you are caught, you can be fined up to $1,000 or you will spend time in jail. So $1,000 in 1850 it's a huge amount of money, and only the very wealthy would be able to afford that. And I don't know about any of you, but for me to pay a fine of $1,000 today would be harmful to me. It would hurt a lot. It's not to say I wouldn't do it, but there were a number of people in this country who said, I don't care what the fine is. If I'm able to help somebody escape slavery and make it to freedom, then that's what I'm going to do. And I'll pay the fine. And then you had people like Harriet Tubman. Had she been captured trying to help slaves escape, things would not have gone well for her. So she was in a grave amount of danger at all times. And there were a lot of people who were working in the shadows like that, helping people along. So the Compromise of 1850 and the renewal of that Fugitive Slave Act made sure that we're just going to tease you. There's a snowbank we know that could help you. So with that increase of the fine and the attention on that, it really made it a difficult thing for people to help slaves on their way. Because what do? You either put yourself in danger, you put your family in danger, you risk a huge fine or going to jail, or you don't help. There's a lot of people who would say, well, maybe, hey, do you think you could help them? Because I don't want to get my hands dirty with that. So the abolition movement was greatly helped by some important people along the way. Often they were either Southerners who stepped up and said, we believe that abolition is the way to go. We think slavery is horrible. And they were very, very good at speaking, and they went around to all these different abolitionist meetings talking about slavery and the evils of slavery and what people went through as slaves. And then along came this guy, this escaped slave named Frederick Douglass. You've heard this name before. Frederick Douglass was a phenomenon in his time. He's still a phenomenon now, but we don't know as much about him as we should. Frederick Douglass was born a slave. He was taught to read and write in secret because teaching a slave to read and write was against the law. And he was so incredibly intelligent and eloquent. So you have this man who has been raised in ignorance, who overcomes that, escapes from his master. He gets hooked up with these abolitionists in the North, and they start taking him around to these meetings. And Frederick Douglass is an amazing speaker. He is an orator of the top class, just fantastic. And you read his speeches now, and he's amazing. So this was a huge, huge thing. This was not some dumb slave, this wasn't some sort of stereotypical, ignorant person, dirty from the fields and all of that. This was a man with fire. And he stood up in front of these groups and he talked about what it was to be a slave. And he talked about what that meant to him as a man, as a human being, and how he could not protect his loved ones for example. So if you are a slave who is married, as much as a slave could be married at that point, and your wife is being beaten by the master, you can't do a thing about it. If your children are taken away from you and sold, you can't do a thing about it. So Frederick Douglass was really great about putting the face to what that meant for human beings who were living in slavery. Phenomenal man. He was in Portland actually speaking at one point to the abolitionist group there, and there's records of that. So when you have that sort of leadership and inspiration, it was fantastic for the abolition movement. Really did great things for it. So that's the background against which Beneath Freedom's Wing takes place. And now I want to bring this to the local area. Well, let me back up just a moment. I want to talk about the Underground Railroad briefly. So the idea with the Underground Railroad was that there were stations. And at each station, an escaped slave could find safety, a meal, and directions to get to the next place. And it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Most of the information that we have about the Underground Railroad is not written down. And there's a good reason for that, because it had to be secret, because there was so much at stake, both the people who were escaping slavery and the people who were helping them along the way. So there's a lot of secrecy, but after the Civil War, things started to come out more and more about, oh yes, this is how I got here, this is what my family was doing during that period of time. Now, because there is so much that is not written, there's also a great deal of, oh yeah, my house was a stop on the Underground Railroad, even though it was built in 1975. But it's fantastic because people want a piece of that ownership. You know, they want to feel like they were part of that now. Now that there's no fine involved, you know, it's easier to be part of that. So, to bring it back to the local area, we know that there was a very active Underground Railroad in the Portland area. And people were coming by land and they were coming by sea. And they were coming into Portland, and then they would be sent different directions heading for Canada. Some of them were heading up like through Machias and Calais and up that way into Canada, which seems like a long way to go. Some people were going north. And then here was an interesting point that I kind of tripped on when I was doing this research. I said, well, if you're coming into Portland and you're trying to get to Canada, where's the closest point where you're going to be in Canada? And it happens to be Canaan, Vermont. And I said, well, that's interesting. And I'll tell you why it's interesting, but I'm not going to tell you quite why yet. So in Portland, there was a man named General Samuel Fessenden. Now, the Fessenden name is a really popular name in this area. There's a ton of Fessendens that were from Freiburg, and actually General Fessenden was from Freiburg. He was the son of the first pastor in Freiburg, William Fessenden. So he was very much an abolitionist, and he was very supportive of the abolition movement. And he said one of the things with the Underground Railroad was that you would be hidden in a house, either in a house or in a barn. You know, there were hidden rooms, secret rooms. And General Fessenden's take on it was, when an escaped slave comes to my house, they do not have a room to hide in. They are welcome in the whole house. Well, that didn't make him really popular with some of his neighbors, as you can imagine. But there was a very strong abolition movement in Portland. You may have heard of the Abyssinian Church. There was it's a black church that was very much involved in the movement. And when we think about the Underground Railroad, I think a lot of times we think, oh, well, these escaped slaves were hiding with white people, right? But they were really a lot of times hiding in the black communities, because it's a lot easier to blend in if you're a black person in a black community. So there was a lot of that going on. And there was this very strong community in Portland where they brought in people who were escaping slavery. They got them clothing, they got them food, and they got them a ride to the next place. So I mentioned last week as a teaser that there was an underground railroad route that came from Portland, and one went up one side of Sebago Lake and the other went up the other side of Sebago Lake, and it joined in the Bridgeton area. Now, it makes perfect sense, right? Because one side is safer to go than the other side, depending on what's going on. And there were people hunting, remember, for slaves. So they're going to send them one or the other depending on what's going on in the neighborhood. And they didn't have email and secret Facebook groups and all that kind of stuff. So there was a kind of an underground communication going on as well. And they had, codes, and they had secret handshakes, all that kind of stuff, so that they could keep the information quiet and prevent slave catchers from finding out what was going on. So here's where this gets interesting in the local area. So in South Bridgeton, there was a pastor named Joseph Palmer Fessenden. He was the brother of Samuel Fessenden, the abolitionist in Portland. So do you think it's a coincidence that there was this underground railroad that ended up in the Bridgeton area? Probably not. Probably not. So that's where, when you're writing historical fiction, there's a place where you have to move from the facts that you know to the things that you can sort of think that probably are true, but you may not have any proof. So here's where I went with this. Joseph Fessenden was famous for his abolition speeches, his anti-slavery sermons. Famous. And by famous I mean people wanted to hang him because he wouldn't stop talking about it. The other thing he was really, really adamant about is that people should not be drinking, because the demon rum causes more problems than anybody can ever imagine. So those were his two things: temperance and abolition. And this is what he talked about all the time. So some of his neighbors didn't really care so much about the abolition stuff, but they were pretty determined to make sure that they were still able to drink their rum. So sometimes when people attacked him for his anti-slavery stance, they were really trying to get rid of him because he was so determined to take away their rum. Now, Mrs. Fessenden's family, interestingly enough, was from Canaan, Vermont. Oh, so you get him from Portland up to the top of the lakes, and then you send him off towards Canaan, Vermont. There's family there that's going to help him maybe get over the border. That's an invention on my part, but I think it's a likely thing that could have happened, certainly. So let's talk about what was going on in Bridgeton, in the Bridgeton area at that time. Pastor and Mrs. Fessenden were in their church one Sunday, when a messenger came and said, the Denmark Militia, those Denmark people, the Denmark Militia is gathering down at the corner. This would be 107 and Fosterville Road. They're gathering down at the corner, and they're going to bring a cannon over. And they're going to blow a cannonball through the front door of the church if this guy keeps preaching against slavery. So they were actually planning to do this. This is like a real thing. So the pastor and his wife and all of the congregation are in the church. And this is the church, not the new church, but the old church on Fosterville Road in South Bridgeton. So they're in the church, and they've got the women and the children kind of gathered in the middle, and then the men are stationed around waiting for trouble. And I'm sure they had their guns with them. We don't really know what happened, but somebody in the mob decided that maybe this wasn't a good idea, or the rum wore off, and they said, "Well, we'll just go home." But it was they were gathering, they were ready with their cannon to blow the church. So this is the kind of thing that was going on at that point in time. Now they were also having abolition movements, abolition meetings. And I don't know if you've run across this book before. It's called 90 Years of Living. It's by Edwin Peabody Fitch. And Edwin Peabody Fitch lived at what's now called Narramissick in Bridgeton. So the Peabody Fitch farm is it's an historic farmhouse. If you haven't been out there for a visit, great place to visit. But anyway, Edwin was kind enough to write down his memories from some of his many years of living. He served in the Civil War, but prior to going into the Army, he recorded a story about what it was like leading up to the Civil War. And he says, I will go back to 1846. These days were very strenuous. The slavery question was a very live issue. The dominant parties were Democrats and Whigs. The Democrats and the Southern Whigs were pro-slavery, and the Northern Whigs were largely anti-slavery. My father was a genuine abolitionist. I had some jingo relatives who were ardent Democrats. You can imagine how shocked I was when my mother explained to me that Democrats, both North and South, stood for slavery. I recollect hearing my father tell me about the Democrats in Bridgeton led by Nat Littlefield. Nat Littlefield is such a mean man. I don't like this guy. He's so much so that I actually made him like the villain of this book. I don't like that guy. Anyway, he was a member of Congress, and he broke up an abolitionist meeting. Later, Littlefield pled guilty to a charge of disturbing the peace, and was, I suppose, fined. Now, Nathaniel Littlefield was a lawyer in Bridgeton, and he was also in the state Congress. So he was a fine, upstanding, mean little guy, but not popular with the neighbors in a lot of ways. So then, I'm going to move over to this really tiny and light book here. And this is, it tells the story of an abolitionist meeting that was broken up by none other than Nat Littlefield. So this man is writing to his cousin, Colonel John Putnam Purley, who's away at Gorham Seminary. And he says, "Think then what must be my feelings when, my mouth wide open, swallowing every word of a most solemn prayer made by my friend Owen, the door was suddenly thrown open and some 25 or 30 rushed into the room. All at once there was an awful thrash, and as nimble a fellow as you ever saw was in the middle of the room, jumping Jim Crow," which was like a racial slur kind of thing. It was said by those who saw Jim jump that he was the first-rate scholar equal to Jim himself. "Such a tumult I guess I never saw. Some were bleating, some were bellowing, and not a few laughing and screaming too. You will judge that the prayer was stopped and the meeting adjourned to Dr. Pease's office then." So they had to put a bodyguard outside the office that they moved to because these people were threatening to break up the meeting and possibly do some harm. Well, after that, the same group of people decided that it would be a really great idea to go out to South Bridgeton and tar and feather the pastor. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with tarring and feathering, here's how it goes. First, you get a huge cauldron, and you put tar in it, and you boil it. And then you get a ton of chicken feathers, or whatever feathers you can get your hands on. And then you take this molten tar, and you pour it on the person that you don't like, and then you roll them in feathers. It causes extreme burns. And by the way, who's ever going to like you after you do that to them? right? So this was their plan. They were going to go out to South Bridgeton, and they were going to tar and feather the pasture. So they go out there, and I don't know if you know, if you're familiar with South Bridgeton, but there is cemetery and Adams Pond beyond it. And then as you start to go up the hill, there's a beautiful house on the left, and that's where the parson lived. Yes, sir?
Why was the feathers?
I think the feathers were really kind of an embarrassment.
Well, I thought it was like for tickling.
Yeah, probably not going to tickle him. No, wouldn't tickle at all. So I think it was really an embarrassing kind of thing. Like, we're going to humiliate you in front of all these people by rolling you in feathers, sort of adding insult to injury. So they all gathered in town, and the word got out that this is what was going to happen. They were heading for South Bridgeton. And so some of Pastor Fessenden's neighbors came and said, "We got to get you out of here." And he said, "No." Like, no, seriously. We saw them, they're in town, they're getting the tar and the feathers ready, they're on their way here. We need to get you someplace safe. And he said, "No." And they're like, "No, really?" So he said, "I'm not going anywhere." So this mob came out and stood on his front yard, and he walked out his front door and talked to them. And I don't know what he said. I would assume he was kind of saying something like, "Oh, and how's your wife doing? I know she was sick. Oh, and oh, yes." And so I think he probably just, the fact that he stood up and faced them, like any time when somebody's going to bully you, right? If you stop and face it, they're like, "Oh, wait, I wasn't planning on that happening." You kind of threw him off balance, I think. And then I don't know where his wife and their adopted daughters were at that point in time. Did they come out and stand next to him? We don't know. Or did he say, "You need to go into the back of the house so that you're safe"? Or did they take them out of there to protect them? We don't know. I think in the book I decided that they were there, but he put them safely in the back. So, but once he came out and addressed the crowd, whatever wonderful words he said, they kind of said, "Oh yeah, I think I'm going to go home now. All right, never mind. This is probably a bad idea." So it did break it up. But there continued to be, in this area and probably every area in the country, this ongoing battle. I mean, people were arguing about it at the general store. They were getting into fist fights. The young people were getting into it. Whatever their fathers believed, that's what they believed, and they were going to fight it. They were going to fight to the death if they needed to. So it was an extremely difficult period of time, very contentious. Yes, ma'am.
What year is this tarring and feathering in opposition? Is it pre-Civil War?
Yes. So it would have been like the Edwin Fitch mentions 1846. And then, so leading up to the Civil War, things just kept getting worse and worse. People were very angry. They were constantly fighting over it. They were fighting over it in Congress. You may remember there was a caning in, I think it was the Senate, maybe it was the House of Representatives, but there was a caning, nearly killed a man over this issue. So they just couldn't get it figured out. And that's really what it came down to. So it's a difficult period of time, and it is a period of time that we know ended up with the Civil War and a tremendous amount of bloodshed because people could not get this, they couldn't get it settled. And it was built in, as I mentioned, at the very beginning of the country, and it kept coming up over and over again. So what I wanted to do with Beneath Freedom's Wing was to kind of preserve that time in a way. And I was thinking about writing the book, and I hadn't gotten all that far with it. And then one day I had this, okay, I'm a writer. Sometimes weird things happen. I had kind of a weird visitation. And this person in my head started telling me a story. And she said her name was Matilda. And I said, "Is it Matilda or is it Matilda?" And she said, "No, it's Matilda." And I said, "Okay." And she went on to tell me the story of escaping from a slave master and making her way north And I thought, well, where's that coming from? But I just wrote it down because I don't question these things anymore. It is what it is. I wrote it down and I read it to my sister, and I was like, I have no idea. But her name is Matilda, and she's got the story to tell. So I just kind of set it aside. And I went on with my research, and there was a tremendous amount of research with this book. And as I mentioned last week with the Purley family, they were big letter writers. Well, the Fessendens were big letter writers too. In fact, General Samuel Fessenden's son, William Pitt Fessenden, whose name you might recognize, he ended up as a Secretary of Treasury during the Civil War for Abraham Lincoln. But he was a senator, and his wife was what I would call a historian's dream date. Because when Senator Fessenden was in Washington, she was in Portland, and she was writing him these wonderful newsy letters about, oh, the children were doing this, and this is what the neighbors say, and oh, your Uncle Joe was here, and his wife Phoebe, oh my goodness, she's a very attractive woman. And she also had that thing that every historian wants a person to have. She had good handwriting. God bless her. Unfortunately, she died way too soon, and her letters stopped. Now, her husband, Senator Fessenden, also wrote tremendous, wonderful, newsy letters about what was going on in Washington, only he wrote them all when he was riding in a carriage to this place and that. So they're like, I'm in the carriage, and I'm on my way. And then he would take his letters and he would run out of space, right? So he would do that dreaded thing where you turn it sideways and you write over the top of it, crossways writing. Oh, sweet mother of pearl. So they left a lot of letters behind. To give you some information about Mrs. Fessenden, her name was Phoebe Beech. She was educated at Freiburg Academy. Her family lived in Canaan, Vermont. But she came to Freiburg and was living with some family so that she could get her education because she wanted to be a teacher. Well, she was called home unexpectedly at the very, very end of her education because there was a tragedy in her family. So she suddenly had, as the oldest child, a responsibility to take care of far more than any young woman like that should ever have to deal with. So at the time that she was in Freiburg, she was courting this man named Joseph Palmer Fessenden, who she later on married. And there's a whole big long story with them of there was a missing letter, so he thought that she hadn't written, and she thought that he hadn't answered, and it was a whole thing. You gotta have the drama. So they do marry. They go to Arundel. And they preach at a church there for about 9 years or so, and things don't go well for them there because of the whole he's talking abolition, and there are people who are like, oh, we don't want to hear about that, and then there were people who didn't want to pay him, so they end up leaving there, and they end up in South Bridgeton, where he was the pastor for about 30 years. So that's how the local piece of it comes together. They end up in South Bridgeton, preaching abolition, preaching temperance, being threatened with tarring and feathering and cannons and the whole 9 yards. So as I'm researching this, I come across this letter in the Fessenden papers, and this one is actually at the British Historical Society. And it's written in Mr. Fessenden's handwriting on the paper that he usually uses to write his sermons. So I was sitting there reading it, and I'm like, wow, this is a really good letter. He's talking about, people are trying to justify that slavery is okay because, there was slaves in the Bible, right? So it's okay. Which, you may hear some of these kinds of arguments today still about, well, if you pick this verse from the Bible, it says this. And then somebody else says, yes, but what about this verse from the Bible that says this? So we still have those same kinds of conversations going on. But as I'm reading this letter, I get to this line that says, well, my husband might think differently. And I'm like, what? So I had to back up, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not Reverend Fessenden's letter. This is Mrs. Fessenden's letter that he has apparently made a copy of. I said, well, that's interesting. So as I go back through the letter, I come across this part of it where she's talking about an escaped slave. And she's talking about what if this slave is being shipped to New Orleans for no good reason. For those of you adults in the room may be able to speculate as to what no good reason might be. And what if she should escape and should tread her solitary and darksome path for hundreds of miles toward the North Star, should lie down in caverns with poisonous reptiles by day, and pursue her lonely journey by night, finding the wastes of the forest less to be dreaded than man, should swim rivers and keep off famine by roots and insects, until at last, thanks be to God, she sets her mangled and bleeding feet upon the soil of freedom. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's Matilda's story. That's creepy, man. So she goes on to a lot of detail about this supposed slave who's escaped and what happens to her because of the fugitive slave law. And for me was, I remember just having that moment sitting in the British Historical Society reading this old letter and thinking, she's telling the same story that this mysterious Matilda had told me. And so Matilda becomes this character in the book who just weaves through. She's the ribbon that kind of weaves everything together. And I was absolutely fascinated by that because I have no idea where it came from. It was just like one of those otherworldly things. And I said, okay. So Matilda becomes the symbol of what slavery meant, what abolition meant, but more importantly, what real freedom is. And there's a point in the book where she talks about she can close her door. Like she's made it to freedom, and she can close her door. And she doesn't have to let anybody in. And she can open the door and she can walk out and go wherever she wants to. So she becomes like one of my favorite characters because of that. But there is record of the Underground Railroad in Bridgeton. So it would make sense that there were people that came through. We don't have any specific people. We can't say, well, there was this woman named Matilda. But we certainly can say that there are people who would have come through this way. We know that they did because of some of the records that are left. Now, I mentioned that everybody thinks that their house was a station on the Underground Railroad. There are some in this area that probably are. There are some that are said to be. There are some that are recorded in history as having been. So there is a house on South High Street in Bridgeton where Dr. Nathaniel Pease lived, and he was the guy who, when they broke up the Abolition Movement, they went to his office. Well, his house is said to have been a stop on the Underground Railroad, and it's over not too far from the hospital on the Monument side. So it is still there. There is a house in Sebago. There's a point where 107 and 114 split off, and on the corner of the 114 side, there is a white kind of big involved with multi-building kind of situation there. That was a tavern. And it's said that that was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and it would make sense that it was, because people would be coming and going, so extra traffic wouldn't really call attention to it. And there were outbuildings, but there's, my friend Alan Crabtree has told me that he has seen the place in the house that is rumored to have been Underground Railroad. So it's very likely that was. And then the Fessenden house, the not Joseph, but his nephew, cousin, I don't know, probably his nephew and his cousin. That was supposedly a stop on the Underground Railroad, and I have actually seen the room in that house that is said to have been for hiding slaves, and it still exists. And that's on the corner of 107 and Fosterville Road. It's the house right before the church on Fosterville Road. So there are various places around this area where supposedly slaves were hidden on their way to Canada. And then there was a man in can never remember where he is. He was in Waterford, one of those towns there. He was known as like the strongest man in town. And he was very open about the fact that, yes, he absolutely would help slaves on the way. So we don't have any details about how many slaves came through. We don't have any details really about how many slaves were moved through the Underground Railroad at all. We have things like Harriet Tubman saying that she rescued a certain number of people, but we really don't have good details, and the reason that we don't have good details is it was a secret. And back then, people didn't blab it all on Facebook, so hooray for that. So even though we are far away from where slavery existed, for the most part, except for those people in New England that did have slaves, we still have that tie to those different places where slaves were coming through. So anywhere that they could get people through and get them safely to Canada, that's what they did. And all along the way, there was this communication network said, okay, you're going to go to this house, you're going to go, follow this star until you get to that point. And it was an amazing part of our history, but a very difficult part of our history as well. So even though we're many, many miles away from where all the action happened with the Civil War, we still very much were part of all of that activity that led up to it. And it's an interesting part of history. And if you want more information, there's a fantastic book called, I hope I get this right, I think it's called Hidden Black History in Maine or something like that. Fantastic, very well researched. And that's where I first came across that piece of information that there was the around Sebago Lake link for the Underground Railroad. Really great information. Yes, ma'am?
When the kids and I were studying the Civil War, I come across learning about freedom quotes. And they talked a lot about how that was very popular in areas like Ohio where they were crossing rivers and stuff. But I didn't know if you had come across any of that.
I've come across that quite a bit. And sometimes it's, there's different people saying different things about it. Some say, it's just a load of hooey being a technical term. And then some people are like, no, that's what really happened. And each quilt block was a direction. And then there was also things carved on trees. So there were ways to communicate all along the way. And certainly within the slave communities in the South, there was a lot of communication about, if you're going to make the break, then you need to go here, you need to go there. There were maps, but a lot of it was verbal because you didn't want to write anything down. A lot of slaves couldn't read. There was a lot of, getting into like the worst places you could possibly go because they wouldn't look for you there, like swamps and things like that. So when Mrs. Fessenden was talking about, the escaped slave lying down with poisonous reptiles, well, that probably was a thing. And there were actually communities that formed out in those swamps to avoid capture. Whether they continued on north or not, they might develop these communities and stay there for as long as they could. So it's fascinating, heartbreaking, and hopefully we've learned some lessons from that perhaps all people are created equal. I'm going to end it on that. So next week, we will be back here, same time, talking about the Civil War. And I believe there'll be a hoop skirt. I don't know. That's what I hear. So thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I know when I was a youngster, I always envisioned the Underground Railroad being tunnels. And I don't know if the youngsters here have an idea of what it meant to be on the Underground Railroad.
And that's a great point. Because when you think about underground, were they digging tunnels? Probably not, no. No, it was all about just that it was underground in that it was secret. Like you didn't talk about it. Nobody was supposed to know where the next person was along the way. You only got the information that you needed to have in bite-sized pieces, because if you were captured and you were tortured, you're going to spill the beans, right? So they trying to keep it so that you only know what you need to know, and your neighbor could be involved in the Underground Railroad and you wouldn't even know, even if you were involved in the Underground Railroad. So they had to really keep it very, very quiet. They had to keep it on the DL. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if you're watching the series Victoria.
Oh, I love Victoria.
Did you see Douglas did speak in England?
I knew that he did speak in England. I haven't seen that episode yet, though.
Oh, okay.
Don't, spoiler alert.
You're ahead of us.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Yes, and he actually had to leave the United States because of the threat to him, because he was so visible. He was threatened, and he was definitely at risk for being recaptured and taken back south. So he had to leave the country, and became a great spokesperson for the United States and the Abolition Movement. Yes, sir.
What happened when they got to Canada? Did Canada accept them very much?
Canada did accept them.
Oh.
Yeah, and when the new improved Slavery Act came out, Fugitive Slave Act came out, there were a lot of people that actually just said, we got to get out of here, and they went to Canada because they wanted to avoid that danger. But yes, I'm sure that there were neighbors who were like, we don't want their kind in here, there goes my property values. But yes, as far as we know, they were accepted and became probably citizens, at least in the future generations.
Yeah, and that lives on till today, as people are being extricated from the United States and they're fleeing to Canada.
So we might still have lessons to learn though, huh?
It's very interesting that there were so many people here in Maine, because Maine is traditionally a white state.
Yeah. That's why it was so important that the escaped slaves were able to hide in plain sight in communities where they looked the same as the other people, because a black face in the sea of white stands out. So they wanted to make sure that they were able to kind of hide them in plain sight, and that happened all the way up. There were various black communities that were helping to hide slaves that escaped.
So how did that Abyssinian church in Portland come to be? Do you know?
I don't know what the genesis of it. Oh, Genesis. Church Genesis. That was funny. I don't know what the genesis of it was, other than that there was a strong black community in Portland. And I know it's talked about a lot in that Black History, Maine Black History book. They talk about the beginnings of that, but I'm not. My person was just passing through, so I didn't get too deep into the history of that. All right, well, thank you very much for coming out. It's a pleasure to see so many people.